Roosevelt, Delano, Astor, Forbes, Perkins, Cabot, Low. If you went to school in America, you know these names. Presidents, buildings, scholarships, the families that built America. Here's what they don't put in the textbooks. Before they built America, they built their fortunes shipping opium to China. Industrial quantities, thousands of tons, millions of addicts, hundreds of millions in profit. This isn't speculation. The shipping manifests exist. The account books survive. The family letters are in archives. The evidence has always been there. So why didn't anyone teach you this? Because the institutions that would have to teach it, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, were built with the same money, the opium money. And they've spent 175 years making sure you'd never make the connection. Until now. Between 1820 and 1840, American merchants shipped over 15,000 tons of Turkish opium to China. That's not a metaphor. 15,000 tons of raw opium. Enough to addict entire cities. They weren't small operations. These were America's largest trading firms, operating fleets of ships, maintaining warehouses in Canton and Smyrna, employing hundreds of workers. This was big business. Legitimate business, by the standards of the time. And it made them extraordinarily rich. The profit margins were staggering. 400% returns were common. A single voyage could net $100,000. That's $3.5 million in today's dollars. From one ship, one trip. The biggest American firms in the trade, Russell and Company, founded by Samuel Russell, whose family would later help establish Yale's Skull and Bones Society. At its peak, Russell and Company controlled nearly half of all American opium imports into China. Perkins and Company, run by Thomas Handeseed Perkins, who would become one of Boston's greatest philanthropists. His firm shipped over 3,000 tons between 1815 and 1830 alone. And then there were the Delanos. Warren Delano, too, the grandfather of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Here's how it worked. American ships would sail to Smyrna, in modern-day Turkey, purchasing raw opium from Ottoman merchants. Turkish opium was considered premium grade, higher morphine content than Indian opium, which the British were shipping in even larger quantities. The ships would then sail around the Cape of Good Hope to Canton, the only Chinese port open to Western trade. But there was a problem. The Chinese emperor had banned opium imports in 1799. The Qing dynasty knew exactly what opium was doing to their population. So the American merchants didn't technically import it. Instead, they anchored their ships in international waters off the Chinese coast. Chinese smugglers would come out in small boats, exchange silver for opium, and bring it ashore through their own networks. The Americans never set foot on Chinese soil with the drugs. It was a legal fiction. Everyone knew what was happening. The Chinese government knew. The American government knew. The merchants certainly knew, but it was plausibly deniable. And that made it respectable. The merchants didn't hide what they were doing. They just didn't call it what it was. In letters home, they called themselves Canton traders or China merchants. The word opium appeared in their account books, but rarely in their public descriptions of their business. When they did address it directly, they had their justifications ready. Warren Delano, too, in an 1840 letter to his wife. I do not pretend to justify the morality of the opium trade, but as a merchant, I insist it is as legitimate as any other form of commerce. Translation: I know it's wrong, but it's legal, and it's profitable, so I'm doing it anyway. Thomas Perkins wrote something similar. The Chinese government has failed to regulate its own people. If they cannot control their appetite for opium, that is not the responsibility of merchants who simply supply what is demanded. It's the drug dealer's eternal excuse. I'm just meeting market demand. But they knew better. Their own letters describe the devastation. Delano wrote about seeing opium divans, where Chinese addicts lay in stupors. John Murray Forbes, another prominent merchant, later founder of Forbes magazine's Family Fortune, described Chinese addicts as barely human in his private diary. They saw what they were doing. They just valued the profit more than the human cost. By 1840, an estimated 10 to 12 million Chinese were addicted to opium. In a population of approximately 400 million, that's 3% of the entire country. Addicted to a drug that foreign merchants were illegally smuggling into their country despite their government's explicit prohibition. The social devastation was catastrophic. Opium addiction hollowed out families, destroyed agricultural productivity, and drained China's silver reserves. The Qing dynasty's attempts to stop the trade led directly to the First Opium War, 1839 to 1842, where Britain forced China at gunpoint to legalize the trade they'd been trying to ban. American merchants weren't directly involved in the fighting, that was Britain's war, but they benefited enormously from the outcome. The Treaty of Nanking opened 5 Chinese ports to foreign trade and effectively legalized the opium business. American merchants celebrated. Their trade became even more profitable. More ships, more opium, more fortunes. And back in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, those fortunes were already transforming into something else entirely. Let's focus on one family, because their story is everyone's story. The Delanos. Because Warren Delano II's grandson became President of the United States. Warren Delano II was born in 1809 in Fairhaven, Massachusetts. His father was a ship captain, respectable but not wealthy. Warren was educated, intelligent, ambitious. He had options. In 1833, at age 24, he sailed to Canton as a junior partner in Russell and Company. He didn't stumble into the opium trade. He chose it, deliberately, because it was the fastest route to the fortune he wanted. And it worked. Between 1833 and 1846, Warren Delano made approximately $2 million from the opium trade. That's $70 million in 2025 dollars. From drugs. Period. His position at Russell and Company gave him access to the entire supply chain. He negotiated opium purchases in Smyrna. He managed the shipping logistics. He coordinated with Chinese smugglers. He handled the silver payments. The company records survive. In 1840 alone, Russell and Company shipped 1,450 tons of opium to China, year after year, for 13 years. By 1846, Delano had made enough. He returned to America, purchased a Hudson River estate called Algonac, married into New York society, and began investing his fortune in legitimate enterprises, railroads, coal mines, copper. The opium money was now respectable. Here's where the story gets interesting. In 1857, an economic panic wiped out much of Delano's fortune. His railroad investments collapsed. His mining ventures failed. By 1860, he was nearly broke. So what did he do? He went back to China, back to the opium trade. At age 51, he returned to Russell and Company and spent another 2 years rebuilding his fortune with opium profits. This is critical. He knew exactly what he was doing. He'd already made one fortune from opium and lived off it for 11 years. When he needed money again, he knew exactly where to get it. By 1862, he'd rebuilt his wealth and returned to New York for good. This time, he diversified more carefully. Real estate, secure investments, trusts for his children. Warren Delano II had 11 children. His daughter, Sarah Delano, married James Roosevelt in 1880. They had one son, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, born in 1882. By the time FDR was born, the opium money had been laundered through 3 decades of legitimate investments. The family wealth was now in real estate, railroads, and banking. Nothing that obviously traced back to drugs. But the money that paid for FDR's childhood estate? Opium money. The money that paid for his Groton education? Opium money. The money that allowed him to enter politics without needing a salary? Opium money. The family fortune that gave him the financial security to become president? Built on opium. And yet, if you read FDR's official biographies, you'll find almost nothing about his grandfather's opium business. The Roosevelt Presidential Library's official biography of Warren Delano II calls him a China trade merchant. It mentions he worked for Russell and Company. It notes he was successful in commerce. It does not mention opium. The Ken Burns documentary on the Roosevelts, 7 episodes, 14 hours, mentions Warren Delano's China trade in passing. Opium is never specifically named. FDR's most famous biographer, Jeffrey Ward, does acknowledge the opium trade in his book Before the Trumpet. But even there, it's presented as a minor detail, something Warren did as part of a broader merchant career. The scale is never conveyed. The moral weight is never confronted. The connection to FDR's wealth is never fully traced. Why? Because acknowledging it fully would require confronting an uncomfortable question. Should we celebrate Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the New Deal, Social Security, winning World War II, while ignoring that his family's fortune came from addicting millions of Chinese people to opium? American historians have decided the answer is yes. Celebrate the president. Forget the opium. But the documents don't forget. The shipping manifests still exist. The account books are in archives. Warren Delano's letters survive. The truth is there. We've just collectively agreed not to look at it too closely. The Delanos weren't unique. They were part of a system. John Jacob Astor, America's first multimillionaire, made his initial fortune in the opium trade. Between 1816 and 1825, Astor's ships carried Turkish opium to Canton as part of his fur and China trade empire. His company, the American Fur Company, used opium sales to finance fur purchases and tea imports. Astor himself estimated that opium accounted for roughly 10% of his China trade profits during that period. 10% doesn't sound like much until you realize his China trade profits totaled approximately $5 million over his career. That's $500,000 from opium alone. In 1820s money, roughly $17 million today, Astor used those profits to purchase Manhattan real estate, block by block, building by building. By the time he died in 1848, he was worth an estimated $20 million, $670 million in 2025 dollars. His descendants became American aristocracy. The Astor family name appears on libraries, hotels, and society registers. Astor Place in Manhattan. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel, though the family later sold it. The opium connection? Barely mentioned. Even academic histories of the Astor fortune tend to focus on fur trading and real estate, treating opium as a minor side venture. But the money was real, and it went into the same fortune that built American institutions. Robert Bennett Forbes and his brother John Murray Forbes both worked in the China opium trade for Perkins and Company and Russell and Company in the 1830s and 1840s. Robert Bennett Forbes literally wrote the book on it. His memoir Personal Reminiscences, 1876, openly discusses his opium trading days, though he frames it as adventure and commerce rather than drug dealing. John Murray Forbes made an estimated $1 million from the opium trade, $35 million today. He used it to invest in American railroads, eventually controlling the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. His great-grandson, B.C. Forbes, founded Forbes magazine in 1917. The magazine's origin story emphasizes B.C. Forbes' journalism career and immigrant success story. It does not emphasize that the family wealth behind him, the wealth that gave him the security and connections to start a business magazine, came from his great-grandfather's opium ships. Thomas Handaseed Perkins might be the most successful of all the opium merchants. Between 1789 and 1840, his firm shipped over 3,000 tons of Turkish opium to China. His personal fortune exceeded $3 million by 1840, over $100 million today. He retired as one of Boston's wealthiest men, and then he became one of Boston's greatest philanthropists. Perkins donated massively to the Massachusetts General Hospital. He endowed the Perkins School for the Blind, still operating today. He gave to Harvard. He gave to local churches and charities. By the time he died in 1854, he was remembered as a civic hero. His obituaries barely mentioned the opium trade. They focused on his generosity and public spirit. The pattern was set: make your fortune however you can, then donate enough to respectable causes that people remember the donations rather than the source. The Cabots, another prominent Boston family, made substantial opium profits through Russell and Company partnerships in the 1820s to 1840s. The Lowe family of New York and Massachusetts, merchant traders who married into the Roosevelt family, were also deeply involved in the Canton opium trade. All of these families intermarried. Delanos married Forbeses. Roosevelt's married Lowes. Astor's married into everyone. The opium fortune wasn't just one family's secret. It was the foundation of an entire American aristocracy. And they all followed the same playbook: trade for 10 to 20 years, make your fortune, come home, invest in legitimate business, donate to institutions, and never speak of it again. Yale University's connection to opium money runs deep. Samuel Russell, founder of Russell and Company, the largest American opium trader, was a Yale graduate. His family helped establish Yale's Skull and Bones Society in 1832, funded significantly by Russell's opium profits. The Russell Trust Association, which manages Skull and Bones to this day, was built on opium money. Several of Yale's 19th-century endowment donations came from families enriched by the opium trade: the Delanos, the Lowes, the Tafts, another opium trading family. Yes, the same Tafts who produced a president. Yale's official histories mention the China trade as a source of donations. They rarely specify opium. Harvard's connections are even more extensive. Thomas Handaseed Perkins was one of Harvard's greatest 19th century benefactors. His donations helped fund multiple buildings and professorships. The Forbes family donated extensively to Harvard. Multiple buildings carry their name. The Delano family contributed to Harvard's endowment across generations. And yet, if you take Harvard's official campus tour, you'll hear about the China trade merchants who helped build the university. Columbia University received donations from the Low family, major opium traders. Princeton received Perkins family money. The pattern extends across America's elite educational institutions. The families that made fortunes in the opium trade spent the late 19th and early 20th centuries donating to universities, hospitals, libraries, and museums. Those institutions gladly accepted the money. They named buildings. They created endowed chairs. They wrote the donors into their official histories. But they wrote carefully. China trade. Canton merchants. Trade with the Orient. Very rarely, opium. This isn't just passive forgetting. There's evidence of active suppression. When historian Jacques Downs published The Golden Ghetto, the American commercial community at Canton, in 1997, one of the most detailed academic studies of American opium trading, it received almost no mainstream attention. When Gerald Horne published The White Pacific in 2007, documenting American drug trading and racial violence in Asia, it was reviewed almost exclusively in academic journals. These books exist. The information is available. But it hasn't penetrated popular consciousness because the institutions that would need to amplify it, universities, museums, historical societies, are often the same institutions built with opium money. They're not going to highlight their own uncomfortable origins. Here's where it gets truly perverse. Many of these same institutions, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, now have programs dedicated to studying drug policy, addiction treatment, and public health. They research the opioid epidemic. They study the war on drugs. They publish papers on the criminalization of drug users. And they do all of this from buildings literally built with drug money, from endowments literally seeded by opium fortunes. The irony is staggering. Universities studying how to combat drug addiction, funded by fortunes made from drug addiction. And nowhere in their official histories will you find that acknowledged. In 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act effectively criminalized opium and cocaine in the United States. It was America's first major federal drug law. By the 1930s, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency, drug laws became even harsher. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. Mandatory minimum sentences. Federal enforcement. The same Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose grandfather made millions shipping opium to China. In the 1970s, Richard Nixon launched the modern war on drugs. In the 1980s, Reagan escalated it. Mandatory minimums exploded. 3 strikes laws. Sentences of 20 years, 30 years, life imprisonment for drug offenses. And who went to prison? Not the descendants of the opium merchants. They were running banks and serving in Congress. It was poor Americans, disproportionately Black and Latino Americans. People caught with drugs in quantities that would have filled a single crate on Warren Delano's opium ships. A Chinese immigrant caught with opium in San Francisco in 1920, arrested, imprisoned, often deported. The Delano family fortune, built on 15 years of industrial-scale opium smuggling, inherited by a future president. A young Black man caught with crack cocaine in 1990, mandatory minimum sentence, family destroyed, decades in prison. The Forbes family fortune, built on opium ships, still funds one of America's most prominent business magazines. Someone caught today with even prescription opioids without a prescription can face felony charges. But the families who made their initial fortunes selling opioids to millions, their descendants sit on nonprofit boards and university governing bodies. The system doesn't just tolerate this hypocrisy, it's designed around it. So what do we do with this information? Some will argue, this was 180 years ago. You can't hold people accountable for what their great-great-grandparents did. But here's the thing. We're not asking to hold descendants personally accountable for their ancestors' actions. We're asking for acknowledgement. Should the Roosevelt Presidential Library's official biography mention that FDR's family fortune came from opium? Yes. Should Harvard's campus tours mention that some of their buildings were funded by opium profits? Yes. Should Yale acknowledge that Skull and Bones was partially funded by drug money? Yes. Should Forbes magazine's company history mention where the family's initial wealth came from? Yes. This isn't about punishing descendants. It's about telling the truth. And there's a modern parallel that makes this even more urgent. The Sackler family, owners of Purdue Pharma, made billions from OxyContin, a prescription opioid that fueled an addiction crisis killing tens of thousands of Americans annually. When their role became public, there was outrage. Museums removed the Sackler name from buildings. Universities rejected their donations. They were sued, forced into bankruptcy, and held accountable. Why? Because they made billions from opioids that addicted and killed Americans. But the Delanos, Astors, Forbes, and Perkins families made their fortunes from opioids that addicted and killed Chinese people. And they're still celebrated. The difference? The Sacklers operated in an era with modern media and accountability mechanisms. The opium merchants operated in an era when Chinese lives simply didn't matter to American society. When yellow peril rhetoric made it easy to ignore the human cost of American business practices. The racism isn't incidental to the story. It's central. These merchants could do what they did because their victims weren't white. An American society could celebrate them afterward for the same reason. If Warren Delano had flooded Boston with opium, he'd be remembered as a monster. Because he flooded Canton with opium, he's remembered as FDR's grandfather. If he's remembered at all, the documents exist. The shipping manifests, the account books, the letters. The evidence has always been there. Historians know this story. Archivists know this story. The families certainly know this story. The only people who don't know are the general public. Because the institutions that would need to teach it, schools, universities, museums, are often the same institutions that benefited from the money. So they teach a sanitized version. China trade. Canton merchants. They focus on the philanthropy and skip the source of the wealth. But you know now, Roosevelt, Delano, Astor, Forbes, Perkins, Cabot, Lowe, Russell. These families built their fortunes on opium. They shipped thousands of tons. They made hundreds of millions. They addicted millions of Chinese people. They operated in defiance of Chinese law. They knew exactly what they were doing. And then they came home and built universities, libraries, hospitals, and museums. They entered politics. They became presidents and senators. They wrote themselves into American history as heroes and philanthropists. And for 175 years, we've let them get away with it. The question now is, what do we do about it? Do we keep teaching the sanitized version? Keep celebrating these families and institutions without acknowledging where the money came from? Or do we demand that the truth be told? Not to punish descendants, not to tear down institutions, but to tell the full story. To acknowledge that American prosperity has uncomfortable origins. To admit that some of our most respected families built their wealth by destroying lives on the other side of the world. To recognize that when we jail people for drug offenses today, we're reinforcing a moral standard we never applied to the people who made drug fortunes in the past. The choice is ours. The evidence is public. The truth is available. All that's missing is the willingness to face it.